Well, when it comes to, I think, gender equality and social inclusion, you'd be surprised that there's still a lot of resistance, although we all talk about gender equality, but still the changes are really slow.
Hi and welcome to the newest episode of Urbcast. And today this will be kind of a special episode because that's the first one of the episodes I recorded during the Urban Future Conference, which is the biggest place and actually Europe's most inspiring event to make cities sustainable. Urban Future Conference is hosted in a different city each year, where thousands of city changers from all over the world share their ideas on how to create transformation and what mistakes are made, how to accelerate change and successfully shape the future of our cities. And this time in Rotterdam, in the beginning of June, we had the chance to again discuss about the future of the cities and try to make them more sustainable. Urbcast had a big pleasure to be the media partner of the conference, again for the third time. And it also means that I managed to record some podcast conversations during this event. And the first one for today is extremely important topic of the gender inclusion in public spaces. And that's why we'll discuss what does it mean to be inclusive in our cities, which city can serve as some sort of a gender inclusion model, role model, what are the projects outside of Europe, and what challenges people face in gender and social inclusion, as well as the role of women's safety audits in urban spaces, the role of citizens, but also topics like decolonizing urban curriculum and knowledge, and also the economic benefits of gender budgeting. And today with me, I will have an expert on the topic, Safaa Cherafi, who is an architect, an urbanist, and gender equality and social inclusion expert. She founded Urban Inclusion Consultancy a year and a half ago, where she consults on the nexus of gender equality, social inclusion, and urban development. So, Safaa, hi.
Hi.
I just wanted to welcome you and give you a bit background to this story because I'm the media partner of this beautiful conference that is called Urban Future. And I think it's not a traditional conference because it is having this very nice social energy. And the social aspect of urban planning and cities is something that I would love to talk about today with you as a specialist, as someone who works a lot with inclusion in urban spaces and not only. And before we dive into that, I would really love to ask you to introduce yourself to the listeners that haven't heard about you before. Well, now they do, but as a means of introduction, it would be great.
Thanks a lot for having me. So my name is Safaa Charafi. I'm an architect, an urbanist, and a gender equality and social inclusion expert. I founded Urban Inclusion a year and a half ago. It's a consultancy firm working on the nexus of gender equality, social inclusion, and urban development. So I work with international cooperation organizations, cities, in order to implement socially sustainable and inclusive policies or design in urban planning.
And why did you decide to embark on this journey, on this topic particularly?
That's a really good question. So I grew up in Morocco. I studied architecture in Morocco. Back then it was mostly about design, mostly about architecture. I had no idea what gender even had to do with it until I did my master's in urban studies. And it was called 4 Cities. I studied in 6 different universities, and one of them was the University of Vienna. And Vienna is famously notorious for being the capital for gender mainstreaming in urban planning. So I met Eva Keil and Ursula Bauer, and they're at the head of gender mainstreaming in Vienna for over 30 years now. And that's when I sort of discovered this link with the gender equality, that cities are not gender equal or even gender neutral. So, yeah.
would you use Vienna as a role model for inclusion in urban planning in spaces?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot more cities nowadays that also implement gender inclusive urban planning or gender mainstreaming in their policies. But Vienna has been at the forefront. So it's been, at it for over 30 years or so. Also with like projects like the Frauenwerkstatt, which is a social housing, if I'm not mistaken, that was built in 1997. It was built by female architects, female landscapers, for women, for single women, widowed. So it was also like co-designed with these female residents. And I think that's something that's quite rare, also because it's not possible now to have tenders geared at female architects. That's not possible anymore in the European law. So I think I would take Vienna as a model, but I'm sure in many ways, like other cities are also taken over. I think like Glasgow is also it's one of the only cities also that's implementing this gender planning policies, but it's just started. So
to also go beyond Europe, do you know of any other examples from outside Europe that could also serve as a great learning to other cities?
Well, there are other examples, but one that I'm thinking of is one that I've been working on with Cities Alliance. I'm also a consultant with the UNOPS. Cities Alliance is an organization from UNOPS. And we work on a project called Femme Medina, which is the feminization or how to make medinas in the MENA region. So this one has been funded by USAID, and it's a project in Tunisia on how to make the Medina, so the old cities or the historical cities, more gender sensitive. So it goes from like capacity building awareness as well amongst the residents, the policymakers, the practitioners, and also implementing like specific projects. It goes through also like resource allocations, which we call gender budgeting, and how we make sure that these resources are equally shared between men and women. So I mean, there are other examples outside of Europe for sure.
Of course, I mean, I would love to focus on Europe specifically today, and also because I think even though podcast is listened to in more than 80 countries, I think at the moment, most of the listeners are coming from Europe still. When we discuss the social inclusion, but also we'll discuss about gender inclusion and gender equality in urban places and spaces and our cities overall, what are the biggest challenges you face while embarking on those projects in cities?
Well, when it comes to, I think, gender equality and social inclusion, you'd be surprised that there's still a lot of resistance. Although we all talk about gender equality or, not per se like feminist cities, but the equality bit is kind of like becoming more and more mainstream, more easily talked about. But still, the changes are really slow. For example, like when we talk about street names, it's, I think in 30 the biggest European cities, like only 9% of streets called after individuals, 9% are female. And that says a lot. And I think there was a study also less than 10 years ago, and it was 7 global cities, so talking about like outside of Europe. And there it was 27% of those streets were named after women. Bengaluru, which is a city in India, had 39% of the streets named after individuals being after women, while Paris at the time was lower than 3%, 2.9%. Today, I think, by 2023, they managed to get it to 12%. But it still says a lot.
Is that because of the culture and the history, which is very masculine in terms of how the cities were developed? Like most of the urban planners, the big architects drawing the cities, they were men.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, I call it the topography of minorization. It's like women are considered minorities when they're actually like more than 50% of a society. And indeed, it's also common fact, so to say, that cities are made by men for men, and more so by able-bodied, young, educated, or like of a certain class men for other men that look like them or are like them. So that means that a lot of the needs and experiences of women and anyone actually that's considered marginalized won't be considered in the urban planning policy or how the city is made. So people that are not cis hetero able-bodied men will navigate the city differently and probably will have their needs disregarded.
I was happy to see actually today at the Urban Future Conference, the Deputy Mayor of Rotterdam was passing that conference torch to the Mayor of Łódź, a city in Poland, because the next conference will be hosted in Łódź. So that was actually, very interesting to see that it was dominated by women mayors, and women become mayors in Polish cities as well, which I'm very happy about. And talking from the perspective of women in the cities, I know that you are also working with the topic of safety, of women's safety especially. And I would like to ask you about some strategies that cities can adopt to see cities more from the women perspective. And particularly, there is this one interesting thing which is called women's safety audit. Would be great if you could say something more about it.
So indeed, when it comes to women in the city, the topic that comes a lot is the topic of safety. I would say it's not the only one, because for me, it's just a small part of how women are excluded from the city. According to the UN, 1 out of 3 women globally has been a victim of harassment or sexual harassment, and most of it happens actually in the street. So when it comes to like strategies or even ways on how we can see this exclusion in the city, it's either poorly lit streets, it's dark alleys, it's parking lots or garages or basements. It's also the fact that women cannot wear what they want in certain spaces, that they cannot use public transport at certain hours, or their concerns are not taken into account most of the time, or their needs. So, and this is where the women's safety audit came about, I think in 1986 or so in Toronto. So it's a tool to make women participate in how they can co-create their neighborhood. So it's basically having women go around by night and write down or comment on how they feel about a certain space or a certain street and what the needs are. If there is a broken light, if there is, again, like a no visibility in an alley and no dead end street, like these kind of things are taken into account, and then they brought back to the municipality or to the policymakers on the people actually living in the street, and in this case, women, reporting back as to why they feel unsafe. There's also something called, I think, Equal Street Names, which is a project. It's also open data. It started in Brussels, Belgium, and it's an open source data where people can map the streets in this case with the names. So also like when it comes to equality. And there's something called, I think, Pin City or something. And it's in India, and you can like similarly like pinpoint on a map where you've been harassed or where you felt unsafe, and on this map, and sort of like cautionary way to tell other women like, oh, I've been there and this is how I felt. And then you have like a sort of like a heat map of the places that are more or less dangerous for women. So yeah, I mean, these are just some of the tools that we can make women, or at least we can see how women feel unsafe in certain places and what we can do about it.
Would such an audit be the first step for a city who wants to introduce more women-friendly policies in the urban space?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the tools. It's something you would do on a neighborhood level, I think, because it's pretty local. It's a pretty small scale. It also engages women. So having women do the work, so more or less, and having them report back to the policymakers or to the practitioners, like what they need. I mean, there's also like other ways of having these participatory processes. So it's not only about the safety audit, because there are also other needs. Again, and I want to emphasize on this, it is not only about safety, and it is not only about women. There's also everything in between. So it's not just men versus women. That's what I wanted to, highlight.
Yeah, I think definitely we shouldn't antagonize. I think that our societies are antagonized enough nowadays. So I'm just more thinking about some solutions that cities that are thinking about adopting those measures, what's the starting point for them? And talking also about the change in cities, I think that it's not a secret that prior to this conversation, we just thought about those topics that we could cover. And I think that one of the ideas you shared with me is the notion of agency, that in a way we all have the agency, and it's not only up to the policymakers and it's not only about them. And I know that this podcast is listened to both policymakers, but also people who are not into politics and policy, and they are, air quotes, only city users and citizens. How would you introduce some of those ideas to citizens on the citizen level? Because as we said, everyone has agency and we are all agents of change.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it's up to only policymakers. I don't even think that as urban planners or as architects, we have all of that power to build a city. I mean, at the end of the day, there are a lot of interests at stake. There's profit, there's the developers, but there's also the people living in the city. We are building cities for people at the end. Maybe not in the US where it's for cars, but yeah. I mean, the main point that I was talking about is that we need to believe that we have the power as well to shape our cities. And a lot of people don't know this. When they vote, they don't know that this has an impact on how their cities will be. They don't realize the impact it has on their housing rights, for example, or on the affordability of the market. Actually, even how wide the pavement will be or not. Like, all of these are policies, and these policies are made by people, and it has to be made for people. And who are these people? It's us. And I do believe that it's all of us. And yeah, it's something that I wanted to always bring back, that we do have the agency and we do have the power, and we just need to take it back. I also for example, I post a lot. I like to create awareness about these topics, that it's not just a niche topic for the practitioners or for those who are into, like you said, urban planning or urban development. Or I think we all have a say in how our cities can look like. It's called The Right to the City. I guess you're aware of this concept, by Henri Lefebvre. And I really do believe that we can all have at least, or that we are entitled to a right to the city and to the resources created in the city.
And what are some of the tools that you are using yourself to work with urban inclusion? Because I think that's important also to mention to the people that you are working with it hands-on. You have the knowledge and you are also the advocate with some agency yourself.
So a lot of the tools that I've been working on start with what we call gender analysis. So in order to see the problem, we need to quantify the problem. So we need data. And I also want to emphasize on this, it's not only gender desegregated data, it's intersectional data. And that's a little bit more complicated, although we can always triangulate all the data. So it's not, and maybe just clarification on those who are not familiar with the word intersectionality. It's a social concept that is now being used more or less in all the fields. It refers to the interconnectedness of different social identities or identifiers like class, race, gender, age, ability, sexual orientation, etc. So, for example, the experience of a brown trans woman or black trans woman in the city will not be the same as white, abled, young person, regardless of their gender. So I think these things are something to take into account as well when we think of, who has the right to the city, or how can we make a city more inclusive? Because we tend to think in these, again, this dichotomy of men versus women, when it's not. It goes beyond this. So it's called gender analysis, but I really want to call it intersectional analysis, because for me, it goes much more, it goes beyond this idea of gender. And that's why my company is called Urban Inclusion, because I do believe that inclusion has way more than just the gender part or just the race part. And so, for example, right now I'm working on a project in Rwanda with the French Development Agency, and we're working on student housing. So we are rehabilitating or renovating student housing from a gender perspective. And that's also something that wasn't taken into account, because you need to actually think holistically. It's student housing again. So you need to think from the start, why are female students not even attending these schools? So it goes even further than just the physical infrastructure. I don't think we can fix everything with design or with policies. So it's also societal changes. And I call this the nudge theory. I mean, I don't call it a concept, but I like to work with this. It's small steps sometimes that will create like a bigger change or a bigger wave. So it doesn't have to like come all at once and we are going to change the world, like, but it's really in these small little things.
Talking about students, let's dive into another topic, which is the education, because the understanding of the cities and the right to the city also, at least partly, has to come from the education itself. Like we as children first, we have to be introduced to the agency that we have in the city. And talking about the students and the education, let's discuss the education in terms of like schools and universities, because there is a lot of things that we can do if it comes to decolonizing the curriculum. And that's one of the things that I know that you also work with and that are important to you. Why should we do it? And what is the notion of decolonizing the curriculum in itself?
Well, first of all, I like what you said about like that we need to teach kids to take that power or to have that power later on as adults. I was in Vienna with Eurocities, with a project with Eurocities 2 weeks ago or so, at Peer Learning Visit, and we were visiting the project I mentioned at the beginning, the Frauenwerkstatt, pardon my German, the Women Work City in English, and we visited a kindergarten, and it was co-created with children. And so and I was baffled because I've heard of the whole concept of like cities for children and how we can like build things for children with children, but to have a kindergarten co-created or co-designed with children who are going to be at this kindergarten. So, I mean, they're really, really young. And having like these exercises just to teach them like, hey, this is your space. You need to actually like it. So what do you want? And it was like sometimes some crazy ideas, but some were simple, like just having the visibility. I mean, imagine like tiny little creatures, they can't even see because the level of the window is like higher than them, for example. Yeah, these like small things where we can teach our kids as well to take over or to feel like they belong as well in the city. And it's not just as adults that they realize, oh, okay, now I have agency.
There was a presentation of the mayor of Tirana, Albania today, and he said that how they introduced changes and how they pedestrianized their main square in the city was through kids, because adults were opposing to that change, as the car is still like very, very, very visible way of showing your status. So it was the children that almost requested the space to play. And once the changes started, the children just were the agents, because they were going back to their parents and they were saying, oh, like this new place is so amazing. And we are so happy that there are no more cars in the place. And that's how the adults, the citizens, also become more and more in favor of the whole transformation. So definitely, I mean, I think if we talk about the social inclusion inclusion in our cities, we can't not mention kids.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're right. But then also like coming back to what you said about decolonization of the curricula, or rather the decolonization of knowledge, or the epistemic decolonization, as we call it, is something that I've been very interested in actually since my studies. Like I studied, like I said, in 6 European universities. And it took me a while, but I also realized that a lot of what we were taught was very Eurocentric. While we were coming from like very diverse backgrounds, but also diverse countries. We came from different places. Like, I mean, there's also like a whole historical knowledge in, say, like where I come from. I come from Morocco. So we have also like Arab architecture or Islamic architecture. We have the Medinas, vernacular architecture, but also how the cities were made. So all of these things were not taken into account in what we were taught, or the concepts of how we can make cities. I don't think cities can be or need to be hegemonic at all, because at the end they are built by people, and these people are diverse, with diverse profiles, diverse needs, again, genders. So even the idea of how we reproduce knowledge and how we disseminate this knowledge is quite Eurocentric in a sense. And even like when we read publications, I gave a speech recently to a company on the Arab Heritage Month in the US, and I came up this statistics that almost like less than 1% of publications were about race in urban planning. In the US, when we talk about redlining, when we talk about like exclusionary zoning laws, it has a lot to do with race. Yet those studies were never published. And it's not that there weren't studies about it, but there were no publications to be found about this topic. It's quite rare. So I think it's really important that we can diversify our knowledge as well and really seek like different types of knowledge and different scholarships. Similarly, I'm sure there are like a lot of statistics about this, but the publications in the major, let's say, like peer-reviewed journals come from European/North American universities rather than, African So where does this knowledge go to? That's what I meant by decolonization of knowledge.
So you would say that it is about getting different perspectives that are coming from different places and are less European or in general North-centric. But how can we start doing it? Because in a way, of course, the universities that are located in Europe, they are building on the European history and heritage. But at the same time, the world is becoming the global village. So a lot of the citizens of European countries nowadays, there are people coming from different countries or even continents. There are, of course, people of color and people of different religion. How would you say we can start doing that, and how to keep the balance? Because, of course, you would not like to replace the history of the European cities and universities, because history is there. So it's about adding those new layers of inclusion. And of course, it's such a broad question, but do you know what could be the kind of first step?
I think my concern, or the general concern when we talk about this epistemic decolonization, is that Western concepts of knowledge have become a norm for global knowledge. So we sort of think or consider these methodologies or these systems of knowledge as the fact and the only truth, when that's not true. And they have sort of infected more local knowledges, or that we also, for example, a very concrete example is how we build in the, say, Middle East, or where I come from. So we used to build what is called vernacular architecture. So it's clay architecture, or with local architectural elements because of the climate, because it's climate adaptation as well. And today, or for decades now, we've been building in the modern way, which is the European way, or which is not a traditional way at all. So we need to use AC, for example, or we need to use different methods today to adapt to the climate. So all of this because we considered that modern architecture was the norm and had to be standardized all over the world. And a lot of regions suffer from this today. And this is just an example in architecture.
When we have the situations that there are the rhetorics of some countries, especially Western countries, where produce, for example, design and export them to other countries, thinking that they are helping. We going to Africa, for example, and saying, we are here to help you. And here's how we build. Use it because it's the best. So that's what you mean, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's also forgetting all the indigenous knowledge and completely burying that away, because we tend to trivialize it, or we tend to dismiss it because it's not modern, or it's not scientific, or it's not this or that. And it turns out that it is actually. It's more adapted to the climate. It is locally sourced. It's going to be more sustainable in the long run than whatever comes from far foreign lands. And because we think that's best, and because we think that the Western world has succeeded in this, and this is the example we need to follow all over. And I don't think that's true. And I think a lot of the global South is now waking up to this, maybe a little bit late, but waking, yeah.
The last topic I would like to cover today is money, because I think that it is also important to talk about money while talking about the concepts, so we can make them more concrete. That's what I mean. I think that commercializing is not bad aspect of ideas, right? It's about making them grounded and feasible. Talking about the social inclusion, there are at least two things I would like to cover. I know that there is something that's called gender budgeting. So in terms of, making the budgets in our cities, what is exactly the gender budgeting?
So, indeed, gender budgeting is one of the tools in gender mainstreaming, and it's making sure that the allocated resources are equal in terms of what women need and what men need. It's not that we divide these budgets more, give more to women, but let's give to those who are more in need. And it also gives room for governments to promote equality through fiscal policies and taking this budget's different impacts on the sexes or on different genders, and how this budget allocation has a different impact on men versus women or anyone in between. Yeah, it's also there to help close the gender gap, because there's definitely a gender gap on how much money we spend on, say, resources that will end up being used by men or boys in the city, for example, public spaces or sport facilities.
Is that the known example of a skate park?
Yeah, for example.
Which is, of course, there are I think I see more and more girls also skating and rollerblading and everything. But I think that's the assumption that I might have had as a teenager, that skate park is primarily for boys.
Yeah.
Boys skate.
I mean, there are actually studies about this. Once you teach girls how to use, or that they're fine skating, they actually do use the skateboard facilities. But it's again in the socialization of these kids. And at some age, at the beginning, kids use the playground equally. If you go to a playground when kids are really small, they're very equally used. It's boys and girls and their parents may be watching over. But once they reach a certain age, preteens, teenagers, you would tend to see more boys on these playgrounds, on bigger playgrounds or basketball fields or, like you said, skateboarding spaces, and you see less girls. And that's actually due to socialization and how girls feel in those spaces, whether they feel included or not. That's also the time when you start having comments over your body, when you start over-sexualizing girls' bodies, etc. So once again, it's not only the design, it's also how you treat others and how we actually socialize these boys and these girls to be in a certain space. So, for example, there's also this idea of having mixed-use spaces or not. Well, it's actually not a bad thing to have exclusively female spaces. You also need inclusive spaces. But then boys tend to also say oh, but it's much nicer because it doesn't have girls in it. There's also studies that were conducted, surveys. So like I said, it also comes to not only the physical infrastructure, but also the social aspects on how we can have more feminist societies, or the idea of the caring city, or the idea of just being able to walk out the streets or use a certain space without being catcalled, or without fearing for our safety, etc.
I think here we can't not mention Yalda Pilsian from Henning Larsen, who also did this great work together with some other people about the mental well-being, mental health of teenage girls in urban spaces in Denmark. And that's something that also showed the lack of spaces for teenage girls. They have no places to hang out and to go out. And some of the places in the cities, they feel that they do not belong to them. They don't feel safe and so on. Another aspect on the kids, and that's why I'm happy that we've discussed the education itself. I've seen this video somewhere, either on YouTube or Facebook, maybe, that was a viral video. I think it was coming from the UK. There were pairs of children. They were maybe 3, 4, 5 years old, maybe slightly more. They've been of different color, or there was also a pair that there was a girl and a girl in a wheelchair. And people, the man or someone behind the camera, was asking them, how do you differ? And the only differences they came up was, for example, that one of them is liking an apple and someone else is liking a banana, or someone has a red color t-shirt and the other one has the blue color t-shirt. So they at all didn't think even of any differences of the skin color, or how mobile they are and so on. So I think that was a really, really, really great video on that. But coming back to the last bit of the last topic, I wanted to ask you if there is some sort of measuring the social inclusion and gender equality. So in terms, if there are some policymakers or people who can maybe invest some money in cities, how would you convince them that it's worth to do it? And do we have any studies and some sort of forms of measuring that? That, for example, increasing the social inclusion in a city equals more money or more income or...
Yeah, I mean, definitely. There are a lot of studies when it comes to this. There was, for example, like projects in London where a friend of mine was working on, and they had their female employees complain about, so it was a factory, I think, and they were complaining about safety at night because they were working at night. And they said, yeah, we can't be working. And actually the developer couldn't think of anything, and they literally dismissed their voices. And one by one, they quit completely. So there was also this idea of retention. They couldn't retain them because of the perceived threat or the lack of safety in this job. And they had to shut down ultimately because they couldn't hire anyone anymore. So I think, when it comes to economic advantages, it definitely has. It's not something that I would like to always put on the table because I don't like to think of diversity or inclusion as something economically beneficial, although it is. But I don't like to think of human rights as something to profit from.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, but also we are different as people, as we just discussed here. So I think that maybe, I guess to some of the people, the economic and financial argument might just reach them in the best way. So whether you are creating some sort of a budgeting or policy, if you know you're having those studies that say that, okay, investing in it, it will bring some return, then you might be more willing to invest in it.
Absolutely. There is actually a study like this, which is started as a joke, actually. I don't know if people are familiar with, I'm sure, with the book of Carolina Criado Perez, which is called Invisible Women. And she starts with this project in Sweden where, they had I think gender focal points, so gender people. And one of the people in the municipality in one of those meetings said, oh, at least these gender people won't get involved in the snow clearing because, snow clearing cannot be sexist, right? And then these gender people were thinking, oh, is it? Let's see. Turns out it is. Turns out the snow plowing or snow clearing was sexist in a way because above, I think 69% of the people who had accidents in winter, so they always started with clearing the roads instead of the pavements. So the priority was the roads. And they had a lot of accidents on those pavements, people breaking a leg or falling off, which also cost the city a lot in terms of healthcare. And the majority of those people who were injured were women of a certain age, but mostly women. So they did their studies, and it turns out indeed that people who use the roads to go to work are mostly men. Those who use the pavements are mostly women. And that's also, there are a lot of studies about this. It's called the mobility of care. So women tend to do more care work in general on a global level. They tend to do more unpaid labor, which is taking kids to school, paying the bills, doing the groceries, taking people to, care or hospital or whatever, pushing strollers and all of this. And it falls upon women. So they tend to get more injuries. So what did they recommend the municipality to do? Just switch the priority, start with the pavements, then do the roads second. And when they did again, they gathered data, turns out that they had way less injuries. So they actually gained money. They weren't spending as much in healthcare anymore. So I think that's a prime example on how this nudge theory or small little things, because in this case, it didn't cost them more to switch priorities. It cost them nothing. They just said, okay, let's start with the pavements first, and then we do the roads.
And that was a great example to close up this discussion because I wanted to ask you for a book recommendation. You already mentioned a book.
That's
would
true.
Invisible Woman be the book you would like to recommend?
Absolutely. There are actually two other books that I was thinking of. So The Feminist City by Leslie Kern, which we already talked about. But I think a lot of people also have this resistance when they see feminist, and it's also written by women, and it has maybe this idea that it's about women and only women. But I really like the book by Yves Rebaud, who's also a researcher on the topic for like decades. And it's called La ville faite par et pour les hommes, so the city made by and for men. And it's something that was published, it's like a little gem of 70 pages that was published in 2015. It's absolutely marvelous because it speaks to men as well on how they use the city and how it's actually like different, because it also talks about the production of space and how men tend to appropriate space or the urban space more. So yeah, I think I would definitely recommend these two books.
So someone for everyone and someone for specifically for men.
Exactly. Yes.
So hopefully this message will reach them, and specifically to those who would never ever reach and take a book with feminism in the title. All right, but Safaa, I just wanted to thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your action on urban inclusion.
Thanks for having me.
I think that that's such a crucial topic, and I hope that's definitely not the last conversation about the topic, but I think it was so great to start with you, someone who is working a lot in the topic, and I hope that you will do even more and even greater things.
Yeah, I hope so too. Thank you so much, and enjoy the Urban Future Conference.
Yes.
Thanks for having me.
And that's it for today. Thank you for listening to the newest episode of Urbcast. This episode was recorded at the Urban Future Conference that will actually take place next year in my home country, in the city of Łódź. Already now you can sign up for the newsletter and stay tuned for the conference next year. Thank you for listening, and if you would like to share any ideas, ask about something, or maybe suggest a speaker, feel free to reach out to me. I'll add the link to the contact pages in the description, as well as some useful links from this conversation. Thank you, and talk to you soon.